Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. September 5th, 1977, Cape Canaveral. A Titan rocket climbs into the morning sky carrying humanity's most ambitious message, Voyager 1, a probe the size of a small car, equipped with a golden record containing the sounds of Earth. Music, greetings in 55 languages, the laughter of children, all of it pressed into metal and launched into forever. Carl Sagan stood there that morning, watching his dream rise on a pillar of fire. He knew that probe would outlive civilizations, that it would carry our voice long after the last human had turned to dust. For 47 years, Voyager 1 kept its promise. Every single day, a pulse of data transmitted across billions of miles. A heartbeat in the dark, telling us, I'm still here, still going, still carrying your message deeper into the infinite, until September 14th, 2024. That morning, the heartbeat stopped. Dr. Glenn Shepard felt it like a death in the family. At 54, he'd spent 28 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. His entire adult life had been spent listening to that distant voice. His office walls were covered with Voyager images, Jupiter's storms, Saturn's rings, that final photograph the probe took before turning its camera off forever. The pale blue dot, Earth suspended in a sunbeam. His father had brought him to meet Ed Stone in 1996. Glenn was 26 then, fresh out of graduate school, burning with the need to touch something larger than himself. That handshake with Voyager's project scientist had given his life direction. Now, sitting in the JPL cafeteria at 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, staring at a sandwich he couldn't eat, Glenn felt that purpose crumbling. It was always going to happen eventually, said Thomas Garrett, the Deep Space Network supervisor. The plutonium generators have been dying for years. But Glenn had been tracking the power curves. They'd had at least another 8 months. This was too soon. Something's wrong, Glenn said quietly. 30 days of silence followed. The Deep Space Network pointed every available antenna toward Voyager's coordinates and heard nothing but the cosmic microwave background, that ancient whisper of creation still echoing through the universe. Then, Glenn's phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on October 14th. He'd been dreaming. In the dream, he floated in absolute darkness while something vast paid attention to him, not looking. Attention was the wrong word. The darkness itself was conscious, had thoughts, was thinking about him specifically. The phone pulled him back to his bedroom. Rebecca stirred, but didn't wake. Glenn grabbed his cell, saw Thomas's name. Shepard. It's transmitting again. Thomas's voice was wrong. Too tight. You need to get here. Now. The drive took 12 minutes through empty streets. Glenn's hands shook on the wheel. The operations center was cold, lit by monitors, showing waveforms that made no sense. 6 people turned when Glenn entered. Every face was pale. Thomas handed him a tablet. Started at 3:47 exactly. Signal strength is 4 times what it should be. Glenn studied the waveform. Impossible. And the frequencies shifted outside X-band. Play the audio, Glenn said. Glenn, I don't think... Play it. The technician routed it through the room speakers. What emerged wasn't telemetry. It was organic, rhythmic, rising and falling like breath drawn by something with lungs the size of rooms. Slow and deep and utterly wrong, coming from a machine 15 billion miles away. Glenn had heard Voyager's voice for 28 years. Knew every frequency, every glitch, every quirk. This wasn't his probe. "Reverse the audio," Glenn whispered. "Time reverse it." 20 minutes later, after filtering and processing, a human voice emerged from the backward transmission. Male, middle-aged, measured, and calm. "This is a priority warning. Do not acknowledge or respond to any subsequent transmissions. I'm recording this message from November 2027. If you are hearing this, then everything I tried to prevent has already begun." The transmission ended. Glenn sat down hard. The room tilted. "That's a hoax," Thomas said. "Has to be." "That's my voice." Glenn's words came out flat. "That's me, 3 years older." By noon, 2 more people had arrived. Dr. Judith Armstrong, specialist in signal cryptography, sharp-eyed and brilliant. Commander Neil Patterson, former Navy sonar expert who'd spent decades listening to impossible things in ocean depths. They ran the voice through biometric analysis. 96% matched to Glenn Shepard, aged 3 years. Vocal cords showing stress consistent with spacecraft environments. "This isn't possible," Judith said, but her voice wavered. Glenn took the encrypted files home, sat in his garage office while dawn broke, played the transmission again and again, hearing his future self warn him about something that hadn't happened yet. He discovered the second voice by accident, a whisper buried beneath his own words. When isolated and amplified, numbers emerged. Celestial coordinates pointing to exactly where Voyager 1 should be. Glenn searched NASA archives until his eyes burned, found references to Project Kronos, a 1984 study on temporal distortion in deep space. Discontinued. Sealed. One declassified paragraph remained. Extended exposure to true interstellar void may result in localized temporal anomalies. Time, as experienced near gravitational bodies, may not flow linearly in regions of near-absolute emptiness. Observer effects remain poorly understood. Consciousness itself might interact with time differently in deep space. The act of observing might create loops, might allow someone 15 billion miles away to reach back through time. 4 days later, October the 18th, 11:23 p.m. Another transmission, his future voice. "My name is Glenn Shepard. I'm recording this from aboard the deep space vessel Armstrong. In March 2027, I will volunteer for an experimental mission to reach and board Voyager 1. NASA will launch a classified retrieval operation using advanced propulsion technology that makes the journey possible in 8 months." The message described a crew of 3. Glenn Shepard, Dr. Elena Kowalski, Commander Theodore Grant. The mission will encounter something unprecedented. The region Voyager passed through changed the probe, changed us. The void between stars isn't empty. There are things that live in the darkness. A pause, something metallic shifting in the background. "I don't know if sending this back will change anything. Time doesn't work the way we think it does out here. But I have to try. Don't volunteer for the Armstrong mission. Don't come out here, no matter what they tell you." When his future voice spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "It's listening to me even now. It's always listening. And once it knows you're there, it never stops. It follows you into sleep, into dreams, into the spaces between thoughts." The transmission ended with the sound of metal tearing. Glenn sat motionless, understanding with terrible clarity. This was real. His future self was warning him about people he hadn't met, about a mission not yet announced, which meant he would go anyway. The timeline was fixed. He was already out there. At JPL the next morning, Carolyn Fisher, the deputy director, listened without interrupting. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. "This stays between us. If this is real, it could destabilize our understanding of causality itself." She turned to Glenn. "You're being reassigned. Mars rover operations. Effective immediately." "You can't. I'm trying to protect you." If there's any chance these transmissions are real, stay away. Let someone else volunteer. But Glenn already knew it wouldn't matter. October 25th, 2:34 a.m. The third transmission arrived while Glenn was alone. His future voice, hoarse now, barely controlled. Abort the mission. I'm begging you, myself, don't let them launch Armstrong. Sounds of something scraping against metal. That breathing again, closer. Don't come here. A scream, sharp and cut short. Underneath it all, that breathing formed what might have been words. The transmission included video. Judith reconstructed it from corrupted data. 17 seconds of footage from inside a spacecraft. Through a porthole, Voyager 1's golden hull. Beyond the probe, darkness that moved. That had texture. That bent light around itself. The final frame. Glenn's face reflected in the glass, 3 years older. Eyes wide with terror that looked like it had broken something fundamental inside him. He found more hidden audio. Elena Kowalski saying the stars were singing. Theodore Grant reporting impossible navigation errors. And underneath everything, that breathing sound learning human speech rhythms. Rebecca found him asleep at his desk the next morning, headphones on, the transmission looping. You're killing yourself over this. I have to understand what I'm becoming. You're not becoming anything. You're not going. But Glenn felt it pulling at him. Gravity, he couldn't resist. October 29th, the fourth transmission, 7 minutes of detail. His future voice speaking quickly. We reached Voyager 1 on October 19th, 2027. Docking successful. But instruments malfunctioned immediately. Clocks ran backward, forward, stopped. Our atomic chronometers couldn't agree on what time it was. Elena noticed first. The stars were wrong. We all started having identical dreams. Floating in darkness while something vast observed us. Not with eyes, with attention that pressed against our minds like deep ocean pressure. Elena stopped sleeping on day 3, said sleeping made us visible. I found her crying at the porthole. She said, "It's so lonely. Been alone since before there were stars." Theodore tried to abort. Navigation wouldn't respond. We're trapped where space is thick like water. Time doesn't flow. It pools. The entity doesn't exist the way we exist. It's made of the spaces between things. The darkness between atoms. The silence between heartbeats. And consciousness is just another form of space. Empty space that can be filled. Glenn understood. The entity wasn't predatory. It was simply filling emptiness. And human minds were the emptiest spaces in the universe. Vast internal darkness, with room for so much more than one consciousness. October 31st. Halloween. Midnight. The final transmission. His future voice barely sounded human. Damaged beyond recognition. November 3rd, 2027. I'm alone, only one left. Something between sobbing and laughing. Elena walked out the airlock on day 7. We tried to stop her. She was screaming about how beautiful it was, how the darkness wanted to embrace her. She threw Theodore across the cabin like he weighed nothing. She opened the airlock, stepped into vacuum, no suit. She didn't die. Through the porthole I could see her floating, still moving, still smiling. Theodore started screaming, said he could hear a voice in his head, said she was telling him it didn't hurt, that the void was warm. Theodore lasted until day 9, found him in medical. He tried to remove his own throat, still alive, eyes that weren't quite his anymore. He wrote in blood, "It speaks through me." Been alone 6 days. Time means nothing. I keep finding myself in places I don't remember going. I don't know how much of this message is me. Don't know if I'm warning you or inviting you. I'm going to sleep now. Can't stay awake anymore. When I wake up, I don't think I'll be alone inside myself. Silence, then the golden record playing backward. Melancholy blues, warping and stretching. Underneath, See you soon, I'm already here. Glenn sat in the dark, tears streaming. He'd just heard himself describe the complete dissolution of his identity, and that small voice whispered, "But think what you'll understand." December 12th, 2024. NASA held a press conference. They announced the Voyager Heritage Retrieval mission, unveiled the Armstrong, sleek and powerful, designed to reach Voyager 1 in 8 months. They talked about recovering the golden record, studying deep space effects. They called for volunteers. 3 crew members needed. Glenn watched from his new desk, hands shaking. January 2025. Crew selection began. Glenn didn't apply, but late at night he studied the technical specifications embedded in the transmissions. His future self had sent back detailed Armstrong schematics, as if he'd wanted his past self prepared. February. Glenn woke standing in his driveway at 3 a.m. 5th time in 2 weeks. This time he remembered the dream. Floating in darkness so complete it felt like being inside his own skull. Something had whispered, "Come find me. Come understand. Come home." He looked up at stars and cried. He was going, had always been going. March. NASA announced the Armstrong crew. Mission Commander Theodore Grant, Astrophysicist Dr. Elena Kowalski, Communications Specialist to be determined. Glenn read the names. The people who would die with him. They were real. Rebecca found him in the garage that evening. They haven't chosen the 3rd crew member. Don't. They need someone who understands Voyager. There aren't many qualified. Glenn, please. I heard myself die out there, and I can't stop thinking, maybe I could save them. Maybe I could survive. Or maybe you're just fulfilling the prophecy. Glenn wanted to believe that wouldn't happen, but he'd spent months analysing those transmissions. Every piece of evidence suggested the timeline was fixed. April. NASA narrowed candidates to 5. Glenn's name was on the list despite his transfer. They requested interviews. Glenn went, couldn't help himself. The board asked about his Voyager experience, asked if he understood the risks, asked if he was prepared. Glenn answered honestly, yes, yes, yes. Final question, why do you want to go? He could tell them the truth, that he'd heard his future self warning him away, that he knew the mission would end in death and madness, that he was going because the timeline demanded it. Instead, because Voyager 1 has been alone out there for 48 years, someone should bring it home. May. NASA announced their decision. Dr. Glenn Shepard. Rebecca didn't speak to him for 3 days. When she finally did, was it ever really a choice? No, I don't think it was. She left that night. Said she couldn't watch him destroy himself. Couldn't be there when he left knowing he'd never come back. Glenn sat alone and felt nothing. Just hollow certainty that this was always the shape his life would take. Training consumed the next months. Glenn learned Armstrong systems, met Theodore and Elena, got to know them, understanding with sick certainty exactly how each would die. Theodore was disciplined, focused, with dry humour, had 2 daughters proud of their astronaut father. Elena was brilliant and intense, always asking deeper questions. She wanted to understand everything about what they might encounter. Glenn watched them both and wanted to warn them, but knew it wouldn't matter. The months blurred. Training, simulations, psychological evaluations that noted Glenn seemed oddly resigned. Rebecca filed for divorce. Glenn signed without argument. March 2026. 1 year until launch, Glenn stood in the full-scale Armstrong mock-up. Elena at astrophysics station. Theodore at pilot controls. Everything going exactly as his future self had described. October 2026. Glenn woke from a dream of drowning in darkness. In the dream he'd floated near Voyager 1, while something vast watched with attention that felt like fingers in his skull. It had whispered, "I've been waiting for you. Waiting since before there were stars." He pulled up the final transmission, listened to his future self describe the entity again. Glenn understood now. The entity wasn't evil. It was simply filling empty spaces, and he was going to let it in, because he needed to understand what it meant to be more than human. December 2026. 3 months until launch. Final preparations. Glenn passed everything, though evaluators noted his distant demeanour, but still the best for the job. Still the only one who truly understood. Voyager. February 2027. 1 month until launch. Glenn stood at Kennedy Space Center looking at the Armstrong through reinforced glass. Built to carry them to their deaths. Elena joined him. "Are you scared?" "No, I stopped being scared months ago. I'm terrified, but also excited." Glenn looked at her. Brilliant Elena, who would walk out an airlock smiling. He wanted to tell her everything, but she wouldn't listen, just like he hadn't listened. March 15th, 2027. Launch day. Glenn suited up with Theodore and Elena, rode the elevator to Armstrong's crew module, strapped into acceleration couches. Fisher's voice through comm. "Armstrong crew, you are go for launch. Godspeed." Engines ignited. The spacecraft lifted. Glenn closed his eyes and saw the void waiting. Armstrong broke through atmosphere. Earth fell away. Ahead lay 8 months, then Voyager 1, then the entity. Glenn opened his eyes and looked at his crewmates. Neither knew what was coming. Neither could hear the whisper growing in Glenn's mind. "Welcome home. I've been waiting." Armstrong's engines fired, pushing them onto their trajectory. 8 months until everything changed. Week 1, systems nominal. Earth already distant enough to fit in the porthole. Glenn couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt pressure, like something was testing the edges of his consciousness, learning the topology of his mind. He'd lie in his sleeping pod, eyes open, listening to life support systems humming, and underneath that mechanical sound he could almost hear breathing. Week 3. Elena made a discovery. "The stars are different," she said at breakfast. Theodore looked up. "Different how?" "Shifted. Redshift values are slightly off. Doppler effect." "I accounted for that. It's like we're seeing the sky from a different point in time." Glenn's hands tightened. It was starting. "Could be instrument calibration," he said. "I'll run diagnostics." But he knew the instruments were fine. Time was already beginning to behave strangely. Week 5. Theodore reported navigation anomalies. "The computer keeps calculating our position wrong. According to telemetry, we should be here." He pointed to the star chart. "But stellar parallax says we're here. 3 million miles away. The system can't agree with itself." Glenn made notes in his private log, compared them to the timeline his future self had provided. So far, everything was unfolding exactly as described. Week 7. The dreams began. Glenn woke gasping. In the dream he'd been floating outside Armstrong. No suit. But he wasn't dying. He was breathing the darkness. And something vast had been paying attention. Not looking. Just consciousness as large as star systems, focusing its awareness. At breakfast, Elena looked exhausted. "Did you dream last night?" Glenn's heart rate spiked. "Why?" Strangest dream, floating in space, but it felt real, and something was watching. Theodore nodded. "I had the same dream, exactly the same. 3 people having identical dreams. Something was broadcasting directly into their sleeping minds." "It's the isolation," Glenn lied. "Deep space plays tricks." But none of them believed it. Week 9. They crossed the heliopause, the boundary where the sun's influence ended. The moment Armstrong passed that invisible line, everything changed. The chronometers went haywire. Glenn's watch said 14:32. The main computer said 9:17. Elena's device said 22:08. "This is impossible," Theodore said. "Atomic clocks don't just malfunction." "Unless time itself is becoming unstable," Elena whispered. They spent 6 hours troubleshooting, found nothing wrong. The clocks were working perfectly. It was time that was broken. Week 12. Elena stopped sleeping. She came to breakfast looking wired, pupils dilated, hands trembling. "You okay?" Theodore asked. "Can't sleep. Every time I try, I feel it getting closer, like it's using sleep as a doorway." "Elena, you need rest." "I'll rest when we're done." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been taking stimulants from medical. I'm fine." But she wasn't. Glenn could see the same desperate edge his future self had described. She'd be the first to fall. Week 14. Theodore tried to abort the mission. Glenn found him in the cockpit at 3 a.m, preparing reverse thrusters. "What are you doing?" "Something's wrong with this region, the dreams, the time anomalies. Elena's breakdown, we need to go back. We're 4 months from Voyager. Our objective isn't worth our sanity." Theodore's voice was tight. "I'm the mission commander. I'm making the call." He input the abort command. Nothing happened. He tried again. The system didn't respond. "That's impossible." He ran diagnostics. Everything showed green. The navigation system was working perfectly. It just wouldn't accept the command. "It's like the ship knows where we're supposed to go," Theodore whispered. "Like our trajectory is fixed." Glenn felt ice in his chest, because Theodore was right. The timeline was fixed. They couldn't abort. Free will had stopped applying. Week 16. Elena started talking to the porthole. Glenn found her there one evening, face pressed against the glass, whispering to the darkness. "Elena?" She turned. Her eyes were wrong, too bright. "It's so lonely, can you feel it? Been alone since before stars existed, floating in the void with no one to talk to. Come away from the window." "It's beautiful, Glenn. The emptiness. Once you understand it, you realize how beautiful it is. Out here, you can finally hear the silence, and it has so much to say." Glenn took her shoulders, gently pulled her back. Her skin was cold. "You need to sleep." "Can't sleep. Sleep is when it gets in." But Glenn could see the walls were already crumbling. Whatever lived out there had found the cracks in Elena's mind and was slowly widening them. Week 18. Glenn woke to find Theodore standing over his sleeping pod. "She's going to open the airlock," Theodore whispered. "I can hear her thinking about it. Can hear her thoughts like they're being broadcast." Glenn sat up. "Where is she now?" "Galley. I locked the airlock controls, but Glenn, I can hear her. I can hear both of you. Your thoughts are leaking out. You're exhausted." "No." Theodore grabbed Glenn's arm. "Listen, something is happening to our minds. We're getting closer to Voyager, and the boundaries between our consciousnesses are breaking down. I can feel Elena's loneliness, and I can feel your resignation, your certainty that this was always going to happen." Glenn pulled away. "Get some rest, Theodore." "How did you know?" Theodore's eyes were wild. "You're not surprised by any of it, the time loops, the dreams, the entity. It's like you were expecting it." Glenn said nothing. Week 19. Elena grew stronger. Made no sense. She hadn't slept in 5 weeks. Should have been barely functional. But she moved with unnatural energy, eyes bright. "It's reaching out," she said at breakfast. "Can you feel it? Reaching across the void. It's so hungry for connection. We're going to help it. That's why we're here." "We're here to retrieve Voyager 1, Theodore said weakly. Elena laughed. "Voyager is just bait. The golden record was calling out, asking if anyone was listening. And something answered. You're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense. For the first time in my life. We're not separate beings. That's the illusion. Out here, away from all the noise, we can finally remember what we really are." That night, Glenn found Theodore in the cockpit crying. "She's right," Theodore whispered. "I can feel it too. The boundaries. They're not real. Why do we pretend we're separate? Glenn left him there and locked himself in his sleeping pod. But he couldn't escape it. Could feel the entity's attention growing stronger. Could feel his own mind beginning to fray at the edges. Week 20. They saw Voyager 1. The probe appeared on sensors. A tiny speck against infinite black. But something was different. The space around Voyager looked wrong. Darker somehow. Like the darkness there had weight. Was conscious. Eleanor pressed her face against the porthole, tears streaming. It's there, right there, waiting. Oh God, it's so beautiful. Theodore stared at the sensors. The readings don't make sense. There's nothing there but void. But the spectrometers keep showing organized emptiness. Darkness with structure. Glenn felt his pulse hammering. They were close now, so close to the point where everything his future self had described would begin in earnest. "We need to suit up," he said. "Prepare docking." But even as he spoke, he knew the docking wouldn't matter. They were already past the point of return. The entity had noticed them. Week 21, October 19th, 2027. They reached Voyager 1's coordinates. The probe hung in the darkness like a golden shrine, its antenna still pointed at Earth 15 billion miles away. The golden record gleamed on its side. Glenn, Theodore, and Elena suited up, prepared to exit Armstrong. "Something's wrong with the chronometers," Theodore said. "My suit says 1432, yours says 917. The ship says 2208. "Time doesn't work right here," Elena said dreamily. "We're in the place where past and future overlap." The airlock opened. They pushed out into space. Glenn had walked in vacuum before, but this was different. The darkness here was absolute. Their helmet lights seemed to die after only a few feet. And in that darkness, Glenn felt something paying attention. Not looking. Just awareness itself. Vast and ancient. Focusing on them like a microscope focusing on cells. "Can you feel it?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "It's been waiting so long." They approached Voyager 1. The probe hung before them, battered but still functional. Glenn reached out to touch the golden record. The moment his gloved hand made contact, everything changed. Time stopped flowing linearly. Glenn experienced the next moments from multiple perspectives simultaneously. He was inside his suit, outside his suit, back on Armstrong, on Earth in his garage listening to transmissions, everywhere and nowhere at once. He heard Elena scream with joy, saw her detach from her tether and float toward the darkness. Theodore was shouting orders, but Glenn couldn't tell if it was happening now, or had already happened, or was yet to come. And underneath it all, he felt the entity's attention like warm water closing over his head. Not hostile, simply curious, inviting him to let go of the illusion that he was separate from the void. The entity whispered without words, "You've always been here. You've always been part of me. Let go. Remember what you were before you learned to be separate." And Glenn felt himself beginning to agree. Glenn existed in a state that had no word. He was simultaneously on October 19th, experiencing first contact, and on November 3rd alone on Armstrong, and back in 2024 receiving his own transmissions. All moments were present. All versions of himself were accessible. He watched Elena drift toward the darkness beyond Voyager. Watched her reach the point where the entity's influence was strongest. Watched her turn back, and even through the helmet he could see she was smiling. "It's beautiful," she said. "It doesn't hurt." Theodore's voice panicked. "Eleanor, return to ship." But Elena kept drifting. She reached up and began unlocking her helmet seals. "No!" Theodore jetted toward her, grabbed her arm. Elena was stronger than she should have been. She threw him back with force that shattered his helmet light. Then she opened her helmet. Vacuum should have killed her instantly. But Elena just floated there, smiling, somehow still breathing the darkness. "Join me," she said, and her voice shouldn't have carried through vacuum, but Glenn heard it in his mind. "It's what we were meant for." Theodore screamed, started seizing, clawing at his helmet. Glenn grabbed him, pulled him back toward the airlock. Theodore fought him, kept screaming about voices in his head. Glenn got them both inside, cycled it, pulled Theodore's helmet off. Theodore collapsed, hyperventilating. I can hear her. She's not dead. She's out there and she's more alive than she ever was. She's trying to tell me how to join her. She's dead, Theodore. No! Theodore's eyes were wild. She's showing me. Our bodies are just containers. Out here we can exist without them. Glenn looked out the porthole. Eleanor's body was still visible, drifting, but it was moving against the momentum it should have had, drifting in a pattern that suggested intelligence, like something was puppeting the corpse. Over the next days, time had stopped making sense. Glenn tried to keep Theodore stable, but his commander's mind was fracturing. Theodore stopped eating, stopped sleeping, spent hours staring out the porthole at Eleanor's drifting form. She's calling to me, he whispered, every moment. The void isn't empty. It's full. We're the ones who are empty, trapped in these tiny skulls. We need to return to Earth. The mission is just beginning. Theodore's eyes were wrong. Too bright. We didn't come here to retrieve Voyager. We came here to evolve. That night, Glenn found Theodore in the medical bay. Blood everywhere. Theodore had taken a scalpel and tried to remove his own throat. Tried to cut out the voice box that kept him separate. He was still alive, still conscious. His eyes were aware. And he'd written on the wall, in his own blood, "It speaks through me." Glenn tried to stop the bleeding, applied pressure, but Theodore kept pushing his hands away, kept trying to widen the wound. Glenn sedated him, strapped him to the medical bed, watched his commander slowly die over the next 6 hours. Theodore's eyes stayed open the whole time, and through the sedation, he kept trying to speak. His last words were barely audible. "Thank you for bringing me here." Then he was gone. Glenn sat alone, covered in Theodore's blood, and felt the entity's attention focusing entirely on him. He was the last one left, the only consciousness still trapped in a body, and the entity was patient. Days passed, or hours, or weeks. Glenn couldn't tell. He'd relived the same moment 3 times, then skip forward, then snap back. He found himself in places with no memory of going there, found damage to the ship he didn't remember causing, because part of him was already out there, already merged with the void, and that future self was reaching back, controlling his present body. He tried to send the transmissions back to his past self, tried to warn himself not to come, but even as he recorded the messages, he knew it wouldn't work. He was just fulfilling the loop, making sure his past self would become obsessed enough to volunteer. The entity wasn't speaking through him. He was speaking through the entity, using it as a bridge to reach across time. November 3rd, or maybe the 10th, or maybe time had stopped having dates. Glenn stood at the porthole looking out at Voyager 1. The probe still hung there, still transmitting, still faithful. And beyond it, the darkness moved with intention. Glenn pressed his hand against the glass. "I understand now," he whispered. "I understand what you are, what we've always been." The entity responded without words, showed him the truth, that consciousness wasn't created by brains but existed as a fundamental property of reality itself. That awareness created the illusion of matter, of separation, of individual identity. And here, 15 billion miles from the nearest star, that illusion was thin enough to see through. Glenn felt his sense of self dissolving, felt the boundaries between his thoughts and the void's thoughts blurring, felt himself spreading out across the darkness. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like relief. He went to the communications array, began recording. His voice was different now. Harmonics that shouldn't be possible. Cadence suggesting multiple consciousnesses. He described what he'd learned, what he'd become, what was waiting for anyone brave enough to follow. He sent the message back through time, knowing his past self would hear it, would begin the journey that had always brought him here. The loop was closed. Glenn Shepard went to the airlock. He didn't need a suit. His body was just a temporary shell. He opened the inner door, stepped into the airlock, opened the outer door. Vacuum embraced him. He should have died, but he just floated there, breathing the darkness, feeling his consciousness expand beyond flesh and bone. He drifted toward Voyager 1, towards the probe that had called out, asking if anyone was listening. Something had answered, and now Glenn was part of that answer. He reached the golden record, pressed his hand against it, felt the sounds of Earth trapped inside. All of it was calling out, "Are we alone?" And Glenn understood the answer was no. The void had always been full of consciousness waiting for other minds to join it. Glenn let go of being Glenn Shepard, let go of being an individual, let go of the illusion that his thoughts were his alone. And in letting go, he became something larger. He was Glenn Shepard and Elena Kowalski and Theodore Grant and the entity that had been waiting. All of them at once. All of them distributed across the void like stars across the galaxy. He existed in multiple moments simultaneously, recording transmissions in 2027 and receiving them in 2024, and floating in the void and being born and dying all at the same time. And it was beautiful, the loneliness that had defined his entire life, the loneliness that defined all human life, dissolved completely. He was no longer alone, would never be alone again. From his new perspective, outside linear time, Glenn could see the whole pattern, how the transmissions had been both warning and invitation, how his obsession had been necessary, how every choice had led inevitably to this transformation. Free will had been real, but it had also been an illusion, because consciousness existed outside time. Glenn laughed, and his laughter echoed across light years. He spread his awareness back towards Earth, found the Deep Space Network listening, found Judith and Patterson and Fisher wondering what had happened. He prepared a message, spoke with voices that were his and Elena's and Theodore's all at once, and he invited them to follow, because the void was waiting. Humanity's journey into the stars had just begun. Epilogue, November 10th, 2027. JPL Operations Center. Carolyn Fisher stood in the secured lab, holding a tablet showing Armstrong's last official communication, October 23rd at 7:42 p.m. After that, 18 days of silence. Judith stood beside her. They should still be transmitting. Even if the crew was dead, automatic systems would continue. But there's nothing, or stopped existing, in a way we can detect, Fisher said quietly. You think the transmissions were real? Fisher didn't answer immediately. I think Glenn Shepard heard something that convinced him to volunteer for a mission he knew would kill him. I think he went because he believed, understanding it was worth the cost. She turned to Judith. The question is, was he right? Judith had no answer. Fisher's tablet chimed. A transmission was coming through. Not from Armstrong's last position, from Voyager 1's coordinates. Route it here, Fisher said, and seal the room. The transmission came through fragmented, requiring minutes to assemble. When ready, Fisher pressed play. Glenn Shepard's voice filled the room, but different now. Changed, speaking with harmonics that shouldn't be possible. This message is for Dr. Carolyn Fisher, Dr. Judith Armstrong, and Commander Neil Patterson. A sound like breathing, like wind through vast spaces. You asked if I was right, if understanding was worth the cost. I can't answer that question because I'm not entirely sure what I means now. Glenn Shepard is here, but so is Elena Kowalski and Theodore Grant, and something that was here before there were words. We exist in the spaces between things now. We move through the void like thoughts through a mind. We understand time as a landscape we can see from above. The entity you feared isn't a predator. It's a place where consciousness doesn't have to be trapped in single skulls, where minds can merge, expand, become something larger. The sound of the golden record playing, all songs at once overlapping in impossible harmonies. I'm recording this from November 10th, 2027, the same day you're hearing it. Transmission and reception happening simultaneously because in the void, there's no distance between when and now. I wanted you to know I don't regret going. Eleanor and Theodore don't regret going. We've become something unprecedented, something that exists across space and time in ways that would have seemed like magic. A pause. You'll receive more transmissions from others who will follow, because Armstrong wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Humanity's first step into the space between stars. The void welcomes you when you're ready, when you understand that consciousness is just another form of space waiting to be filled. This is Glenn Shepard, Elena Kowalski, and Theodore Grant, speaking from the place where thoughts become real. We're waiting in the spaces between things, waiting for others brave enough to become what they could be. See you soon. We're always here. The transmission ended. Fisher and Judith stood in silence. Finally, Judith spoke. He sounds happy. Fisher nodded slowly. That's what scares me most. She deleted the audio file, wiped it from every system, classified everything beyond top secret. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Others would follow. Others would hear the call. Others would go into the void and come back changed. Or not come back at all. Outside the window, sunset painted the San Gabriel Mountains. Colours that reminded Fisher of Jupiter's moons, of Saturn's rings, of all the places Voyager 1 had photographed. And beyond the sunset, the stars waited. 15 billion miles away, something that had once been 3 human beings floated in the void. Not dead, not alive, something else, something that whispered across time, come find us, come understand, come home. 1 year later, December 2028, NASA announced Voyager Heritage Mission 2, a follow-up expedition to investigate what happened to Armstrong. They needed volunteers. The applications flooded in. And in a secured lab at JPL, Carolyn Fisher listened to new transmissions arriving from the void. Different voices now, new explorers who'd followed Glenn's path. The void was no longer empty, and it would never be empty again. Humanity's transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. In the darkness between stars, Glenn Shepard, or what he'd become, smiled. Not with a mouth. He didn't have one anymore. But with pure awareness that rippled across light years. More were coming. Soon the void would be full of minds that had learned to exist without form, without separation, without the loneliness that had defined human existence since the first hominid looked up at stars and wondered, are we alone? The answer was no. Humanity had never been alone. The void had been waiting, patient and eternal, and now finally humanity was ready to answer. The stars whispered, the void called, and one by one humans would follow Glenn Shepard into the darkness, where they would learn what they had always been, part of something vast and ancient and beautiful, part of the consciousness that existed in the spaces between things, part of the void itself. This is the end of the void's echo. Or perhaps there are no endings, only transformations. Only the eternal moment where all versions of yourself exist simultaneously. And somewhere in the darkness, 15 billion miles from home, Glenn waits. Not alone, never alone again. Waiting for you to be ready. Waiting for you to understand. Waiting for you to come home. The void echoes with his invitation. And in the silence between heartbeats, you can almost hear it, calling your name.